千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together.
Well, hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be able to share this time together again. Today's presentation is entitled Opening and Closing, and that's, of course, day 46 of the Tao of Joy Every Day. And the subtitle I've chosen is The Karmic Mechanism. And also, I've tweaked my format just a little bit, so you may see something a little unfamiliar today from the normal scheme, shall we say. So as always, I'll start with a review of day 45, which was the essence. And of course, we talked about there being an essence within both the physical and spiritual realms. And that these essences exist within each and every one of us as well. And some refer to the essence as by calling it God. Others refer to it in a secular way. But everyone has the essence, regardless of whether they're believing in God or they're an atheist or there's some mix in between those two. The key to spirituality, of course, is becoming aware of those essences and how they move in your life. So as Tao cultivators, it's simply the way of existence and reality. And we might refer to it as that sacred part of ourselves, the true self, or the soul, if you wish. And of course, it's made up of these same essences. And one key point is that those essences are, of course, eternal. They're forever. And as we're locked inside a body, inside space and time, that is, in fact, a matter of faith. It has to be a matter of faith. The best way to experience the essences is to connect with what and who we love. Ultimately, love is what drives our existence. It really is the reason we're here. You know, when we're kind and understanding, when we're compassionate, when we're generous, when we're expressing those essences from our best and true selves, when we act out of love for others. But it also can be love for yourself, because oneness connects everyone. So to love yourself is to love others. To love others is to love yourself. And that may sound like an odd kind of double talk. But if you really believe in oneness, if you really believe that we're all connected, that we all have these same essences that come from the Tao, then you understand that. And, you know, if you take away love, let's face it, life is scarcely worth living. Fortunately, it's impossible to remove love completely. And you might ask why. Well, because it's part of the essence. And that's with us from the beginning. It'll be with us from the end. It'll be with us after. And it'll be with us if and when we come back. Even people who seem to be totally lost still have their best selves inside them. You might think of extreme examples. That's easy to do. You know, the one that comes to mind, of course, is Adolf Hitler. For some reason, he sticks out. You could also pick Stalin. I mean, arguably, Stalin's responsible for more human death than Hitler was, in a way. And yet, Hitler is the one that captures the imagination. But as a matter of faith, both those men had true selves. Both those men committed horrible acts. Both of those men have died. And both of those men have returned to the Tao. So even people who may seem to be totally lost, have their best self inside them. And the connections are always available to anyone who wants to use them. Love can never be destroyed because it is the very expression of existence itself. So the last point from last week, hatred and fear are no match for love. You know, when you talk about creation and destruction, Derek pointed out recently that, you know, if you think about creation and destruction, creation can take a lot of time. Destruction can happen rather quickly. And he gave a wonderful example of that. I'm sure we all remember it. But it's an example, you know, when you think of hatred and fear versus love. If, you know, love is difficult in a way. It's difficult to act out of love, and it's easy to act out of hatred and fear because of selfishness and greed and wanting what's best for us. And when I say us, I mean for ourselves instead of for others. Whereas love is selfless and love is kind. So ultimately, it's not a fair fight. Just like creation and destruction may not be a fair fight on the surface. But anything that had the energy to create can always be recreated. And so, in a way, creation really can trump destruction in that sense. If it was created once, it could be created again. You just have to know how to do it. So, how do we feel when we experience hate and fear? Compare that to the feeling of being loved. Think of a loving parent or a loving spouse or a loving child. That feeling is no match for the people in your life that you feel hate and fear towards. Which should we choose? Well, as I pointed out last week, that's an easy answer. We should choose love. Okay, so that was last week, and now we move into day 46, opening and closing, the karmic mechanism. So here's my first point, really Derek's first point, as he moved through the chapter, the Tao of Joy Every Day, and it's this. Moderation is a necessary Tao teaching when it comes to giving and receiving, and of course, in all areas of life. Now, unfortunately, often people incorrectly think that moderation is an excuse to do what they want instead of doing the right thing at the right time. And, you know, this is where people often misstep in Eastern philosophy, or why they like Eastern philosophy, because it has this quality of, oh, you know, I'm not being, you know, inconsiderate. I don't want to give too much because then I'll damage my ability to give, or something like that, and invoking the moderation principle. But of course, the meaning of that is deeper, and hopefully we'll be able to point that out as we move through this presentation today. So in this chapter, Derek describes the clenched fist of a miser, and he uses it as an example of someone who's created a condition that makes it impossible for him or her to give to anyone. So, you know, obviously a clenched hand can't hand anyone anything. And so he or she has in fact crippled his or her hand by closing it with greed. Now, by contrast, a sage knows when he or she is able to give and then gives generously and anonymously when possible, that the hand is opened. But a sage knows there's no contrivance. The sage knows that it's being done not for show. And when you know that, then there is no contrivance and it's not for show, and you're doing it in the right way. And so your hand can open and close naturally, as it should. And that's really the deeper principle of moderation. So I want to point out another example of the misunderstanding of the moderation principle is someone who spends his or her money or time wastefully. This also will cripple the ability to give generously and anonymously. You know, in life, we have to handle our situations before we could be of assistance to others. So if you want to be able to give, you have to have something to give. And we all can do it, but we have to manage our lives correctly. Think of all the waste that we do in this society. Whether it's leaving a light on when no one needs light at that moment, whether it's taking the time to put things in the recycle bin versus the trash can, things like that. Now, arguably, not taking the time to do it well and correct can ultimately be wasteful. And so when we waste, we also cripple our ability to give, because there's a measure of everything. In this existence, we know there's a measure of everything because of science. And we know that science can't measure precisely, but it can measure very, very, very close. So everything fundamentally can be wasted or can be used. And of course, energy, well, energy transforms. It never really gets wasted. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out today. That to be wasteful is also to cripple your ability to give. So it's important to manage your life so that you're not wasting, so that you save, so that you get your house in order, both financially, spiritually, have your body in order, because you can't help anyone if you've died either. So if we do all those things, then we're able to help. And then we have to just make sure that it's not contrived, that it comes from the natural wellspring of the Tao, which is within each of us. So I'm going to begin to sum it up now. So we can use the moderation principle in a meaningful way. When we do this correctly, our action will be aligned with the great Tao, regardless of how people relate to it. The Tao is the Tao, no matter what we call it or what others call it. So we're not limited to helping only people who are Tao cultivators. We can help anyone. You know, oftentimes you'll hear things that people tend to be tribal. They group into the groups that they're in. You know, carpenters are in a special group. People of race or ethnicity are in a certain group. It could be anything. Humans are naturally tribal. It has to do with our evolution. But ultimately, the Tao calls us to something higher. And that's to basically see the oneness in all people, let love be your guide, and to not be tribal. Is it possible to do that? Well, I believe it's possible. I believe that sages do it. Think of the hand opening and closing as Derek described in this chapter. It knows when to avoid shows of generosity and when to open the hand to give in a sincere and meaningful way. Also, we should avoid being wasteful. When the hand is open all the time, be aware of your true motives. Incorrect motives will lead to wastefulness. We don't want to squander what the Tao provides. To be trusted with the power of the Tao, one should not give unless they have mastered the karmic mechanism. This means their actions must be without contrivance. Now, it's not easy, and in some ways we have to cultivate awareness of the Tao first so that we can understand its movements. It takes practice, but if our hearts are sincere and we follow the Tao teachings of moderation, we will take uncontrived actions at the right time and in the right way. We should let love be our guide when it comes to giving and receiving. And so now this is the new part of the format. And if you've never read the story of the water pump in the Tao of Daily Life, it's a wonderful story that talks about the karmic mechanism. And, that's why I added this to the presentation. And this will be a permanent staple, I think, from now on. But I wanted to retell the story that I think many of you have probably already heard. And I'll do it in my own words. I won't read directly from the book, but as the story goes, there's a man walking through a droughted area, and he's trying to get to the next town, and he is running out of water in his canteen, and he in fact does run out of water, and he thinks it's over, and then he sees this sort of shack out in the middle of this wasteland, so to speak. And he thinks, well, maybe this is a mirage, but I'm going to get to it. And he gets to it, and he goes inside, and inside there's a bottle of water off to the corner with a cork in it to keep it from evaporating. And there's a pump of some sort. It looks like a water pump. And there's a map of the area. And of course, the person sees all this, but he's near, death. And the first thing, of course, he does is he hopes that this water pump will give him water. So he starts to pump it vigorously, but nothing comes out. And so that's when he notices the water off to the side and the note and the map of the area. And he looks at it, and the note says, hey, in order to make the pump work, you've got to pour the water inside to prime the pump, and then you'll get your fill of water. Just remember to fill the water bottle back up. And so he's left at this crossroads where he can trust the note, pour in the water, and hope that he gets his fill of what he needs and enough to fill the water back up. And so he decides, as he's at near exhaustion, to go ahead and try. So he pours the water in, and he starts pumping vigorously again. And sure enough, the water comes forth after the pump is primed. And he drinks his fill, he quenches his thirst, he fills his canteen. And then, as the note said, he filled the water back up, and he took a map and knew where he was going now to get to his next destination, his next town. And with the pencil that was there, he wrote, "It really works." And he sealed up the water bottle for the next person and put it there. And he then had everything he needed. So he left the shack as it is, other than his added note of, hey, it really works. And he went on his way. And of course, this is the story of the karmic mechanism, which I was trying to convey in today's presentation. And so this will be a permanent part of my Tao, excuse me, Tao of Joy presentations from now on, along with my book recommendation for the Tao of Joy, which, of course, as I always say, is a great book to use daily to help one study and learn the Tao teachings and put them into action. So there it was, opening and closing, day 46, the karmic mechanism. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I hope I said something that was helpful, and I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday.
Alex, thank you for that great presentation. Tim joins me in thanking you for the great presentation, Alex, and also for the connection to the water pump story, because it fits so nicely together with your talk. And also from Mike, great talk. And just to emphasize one particular point that you were making, the story of the water pump reflects dilemmas from daily life for all of us. In the story, the traveler coming across this pump and the notes and the bottle of water may very well be besieged with doubt. How do I really know that the water pump is working? It looks like it's been abandoned for quite some time. So suppose there is nothing more and I'd be wasting this water priming the pump, and this reflects on so many of the processes that we encounter in life where the idea is that you have to invest in a bit of yourself first without expectations, without being fixated or attached to a particular outcome. And then if you can do that, like a gardener planting seeds when the time is right, you are amply rewarded with blossoming flowers or a bountiful harvest. So it's like that with the karmic mechanism too. A lot of times you may be tempted to just maximize your short-term gain, sort of the mentality of take the money and run quick. But if you are able to hold yourself off and think of the bigger picture, oftentimes by contributing to the overall system, our entire human society is a giant water pump, so to speak. So if you are able to prime it, you end up enjoying an abundance of rewards, more than you could possibly expect, more than you can possibly use. So I would like to remind everyone that if you come across a situation like that, when in doubt, go with the Tao and prime the pump. Now there's an excellent question from Barry. Let me present it, and then as everyone is thinking it over, I'll make another point about creation and destruction, and then we'll circle back to the question from Barry. So Barry's question centers around the idea of moderation. So there's gonna be any number of times when people are asking, well, how does moderation apply? So a common example would be, well, how does moderation apply when it comes to the issue of, for instance, abortion, pro-choice, pro-life? You can't be half pregnant, the saying goes. So in a similar way, Barry is asking, what would be the moderate position between supporter and opposition of slavery? So a lot of times, people who invoke moderation position themselves conveniently between two extremes, and at times in an excessive way. So I want to put that question out there for everyone's consideration. And I'll circle back and ask Alex for his thoughts on that. And in the meantime, I also want to say a little bit about creation and destruction. As you know, I oftentimes like to talk about these beautiful statues from antiquity as examples of creation and destruction and how the two are not really even, not symmetrical. That is, it takes a long time, it takes planning, talents, sustained hard work over weeks to chisel away at a piece of marble until it turns into this beautiful statue that the artist had envisioned in the beginning. And prior to that, there's actually also a very lengthy process to deal with the quarry to select the right stone, the right, giant piece of marble, and then to be able to envision what you would like it to be once you've chipped away everything. And the famous story about the beautiful statue of David was that Michelangelo said, he for him it was easy. He simply took away all the parts of the marble that was not David to reveal this beauty that was hidden but had the potential of manifesting. So this touches on a lot of the Tao teachings, including the teaching of Pu, which is the idea that in its original state, when a rock has not yet been worked on, it is at its point of maximum potential. It can become just about anything you can envision. And as you take away more and more of the marble, it becomes ever more specific until they take shape. And what shape it takes depends on what you set out to do. You could perhaps create a vessel out of this carving, out of the chiseling process, or you could create a work of art. So perhaps an instrument, a tool, a work of art, etc. So this brings me to mind the moment when the truth of the teaching from the Tao struck me. It was when I was admiring beautiful statues from antiquity. Here in Southern California, we're very lucky and blessed to have free access to the Getty Museum, which has a world-class collection. And many of the statues from antiquity had damage. Perhaps nose is struck off or an arm, perhaps the head. So it really brought home the point, that these beautiful works were damaged. For instance, in the barbarian sacking of Rome, when the attackers, the invaders, having gained access to the city proper, went through on a rampage and took a hammer, took weapons to all these beautiful works of arts, and it really didn't benefit the barbarians in any way. It was mostly just to vent their hatred and frustration of Rome that they saw as their enemy. So many of these works were damaged in that way. And yet, here we are, thousands of years later, putting these damaged works of art in a museum so we can still admire them. And so these are all parts of the human heart. The part that is out to destroy, to burn, to damage, to harm. And aren't we seeing that too being played out every day in the news cycles? There's definitely that destructive impulse running loose and crazy in the world. At the same time, counter to that, and at greater strength, there's also the human tendency to love beauty, to preserve the fruits of civilization, to present all that is best about ourselves, to restore. And more importantly, to keep these ideas in the heart. So even when something physical is destroyed, we can recreate anew. So humanity continues, our spiritual evolution continues. As easy as it is to destroy rather than to create, the power to preserve and create anew and to present and to showcase that which is the best in humanity is even stronger. So the two sides are definitely not even. And now let's return to the point about support or opposition of slavery. And I would like to also invite everyone listening in to contribute their thoughts and opinions on this. And I like to go to Alex about applying moderation to such a dichotomy, support or opposition of slavery.
Okay. The way I would try to describe it is this. Now, keep in mind, in this life, in this time and space, I have no experience with slavery, but I've studied it in history. And the example of moderation that I think of is Jefferson. It's an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, he, I think, owned something like more than 200 human beings in the course of his life. And as a legislator, he tried to pass, I think it was 17 different kinds of legislation that would have either curtailed or ended slavery. So Jefferson, in a way, to me, embodies that moderation on one side of the coin. As a political figure, he tried to slowly do things, plant seeds, so to speak. But as a personal man, in his personal life, he owned human beings. But an interesting thing, I mean, we can't know whether Jefferson was a sage or not. That's really not for us to know. But what he did was he planted the seed, and an interesting thing happened. One, he inspired many of the people in Virginia to free all their slaves, even though he didn't personally. And also, too, it's argued that his Declaration of Independence that he wrote, his rhetoric from it, is what inspired the abolitionists that did end slavery. Now, was Jefferson a sage? Well, we can't answer that. But he definitely planted a seed at the right time. Now, whether he did that for political motives or because he was a decent and good man, we can never know that. Only he can know that. And of course, he's gone now. And I think moderation is to trust your instincts, to act out of love when you can. And as far as, one thing I often hear, of course, is that slavery was purely economic. And of course, it had that aspect to it. But if you think about the ending of the slave trade in England, it was really one man who brought that about. And he went his whole life trying to end the practice of the slave trade. And he did, in fact, to do that. I think it was in 1803. And the man was William Wilberforce. And in a way, that little seed that he planted really set the dominoes falling. Because the last place black slavery existed was in the U.S. And it contradicted our rhetoric of the Constitution. It was at odds from the beginning. And so that seed, together with Jefferson's seed, slowly over time, slavery is no more. It's no longer legal in this country. Now, Of course, slavery still exists in the world. But somehow in the middle, there's moderation. We can oppose it in our hearts. And sometimes that's the best we can do.
Excellent, Alex. And to go on, to continue on with one of your points, is that slavery still exists in the modern world. There's human trafficking that is occurring all the time throughout the entire world. Even though overall, I think slavery is one of the settled, quote unquote, settled issues in human ethics and morality. That is, there's wide spectrum agreement. There is no controversial disagreements on the ethics and morality of owning another human being like chattel. Just like genocide is a settled issue. So we can pretty much all agree, or at least I hope, that it would be a very bad thing to wipe out an entire group of humanity. There can be no controversy about that. And the settling of these issues oftentimes comes from secular sources, in that a religion may not be a reliable guide to whether or not something is right or wrong. We do see writings in religious texts that provide guidelines on how to own slaves, as an example. And also, as Barry pointed out, there are religions, there are certain even harsh requirements, regulations over slavery, and yet not complete abolition, that in many parts of the world we take for granted today. And my friend Mike is pointing out, think about wage slavery, in capitalism. That is slavery of a sort as well, in that the human beings who are trapped in it have no way out. There's no conceivable freedom. It is as much an ownership, in this case, perhaps by a corporation, as it was, in ancient days, by a slave owner. So Maria makes the same point. It's not just human trafficking; it's also labor exploitation by the rampant forms of today's capitalism. All very true. And this is, much more contemporary. It's not about communism or Marxism. So as an example, and this gets into all kinds of discussions about minimum wage, about temporary employees, people who are struggling from paycheck to paycheck, multiple jobs just to survive because they're all low-paying jobs. And, everyone's circumstances will differ depending on where they happen to be, the economic conditions surrounding them. But, looking deeper into it, it's definitely true. And thank you, Mike and Maria, for pointing this out. This is not a simplistic issue. So,
Derek,
go ahead. Sorry.
is it okay if I add something?
Absolutely. Let me pause for a moment.
One thing I wanted to add is that a lot of times change has to start spiritually. And when I think of William Wilberforce ending the slave trade, he was inspired by, I think a man named John Newton was his name, and he was a musician, and he wrote the song Amazing Grace, which I think we've all heard. And of course, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. And of course, the thing was, John Newton was a first mate on a boat, and somehow it was a slave trading boat, and he got captured as a first mate and ended up being a slave. But back in England, he had a father who was very wealthy, who went out and sent people out to look for him. And I forget how long he was a slave, but it was many years. But his father rescued him, and he went back to the slave trade and became a sea captain and continued as a sea captain in the slave trade. But he wrote that beautiful Christian spiritual song, "Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound," and it's about his experience of being a slave. And that seed really is what was planted in Wilberforce, because Wilberforce met with Newton and heard his story. And so that seed allowed Wilberforce, to plant his seed. And really, once that spiritual seed was planted, the dominoes eventually fell. Now, they haven't fallen all the way, as we've all pointed out. Slavery still exists. And I remember how shocked I was when I first really realized that. I was talking to someone who had served in Kuwait during Gulf War I, and I was trying to be conversational. So I said, "Hey, what was Kuwait like?" And he told me, well, the most shocking thing for me was that slavery still exists. And I remember my jaw dropped. It never occurred to me that it was still legal in places. That blew my mind. So, but I think for us, in terms of moderation, we have to remember that it starts spiritually. And the spiritual realm does influence the realm we live in here. And sometimes it's just a little bit of moderation that's required. And sometimes it's just spiritual moderation that will start the dominoes falling. And as far as when they fall all the way, well, obviously we're not there yet. But I think we will be. But that, of course, is a matter of faith.
Indeed. And, from what you're saying, I like to quote Wayne Dyer in that one of the titles of his books is "There's a Spiritual Solution to Everything." I actually believe that to be true, and that I think it's very powerful that everything has to begin spiritually. And that's the source of powerful change in society. We may not all be in a position to do anything about the still existing problem of slavery and human trafficking and wage slaves, etc., in today's world. But we can begin to work on ourselves spiritually to think about these in the proper way. So, to my thought, moderation in the Tao, when applied to something like this, does not suggest a halfway point between support and opposition. What does that mean? Does that mean half-hearted support? Does that mean half-hearted opposition? Does that mean total neutrality? What is that exactly? So, as I said, it's a settled issue. So I would say I would rescope, recast the spectrum of moderation in not between support and opposition, but between a zealous, obsessive opposition and apathy. So that is, we all have a duty to have a definitive, unambiguous opposition to it, but we may not all be able to go to obsessive extremes to bring about its end. We can definitely begin by working on ourselves, educating ourselves in the process on the situation that's out there. There's an actor by the name of Dolph Lundgren. He gained fame and fortune back in the 80s, and then there was a duration of time in which he was down on his luck. But he gave a talk recently, and he talked about the one thing that brought meaning back to his life. He found a cause in coming across someone who was actually the victim of human trafficking. And his jaw dropped when he realized that indeed slavery is still going on, and not just in a different part of the world, but close right here at home in his case, in the United States, in Southern California. So he began contributing what he could, taking whatever action he could to free a particular individual from the bonds of slavery, and then educating himself on the overall situation, and then doing what he can, even now, to continue contributing to the battle in opposition to that. So that, I think, would be a great way to apply the Tao to controversial topics like this one. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us travel safely. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.